room. The reading room. The reading room. The reading room.
This is episode 18, Tomorrow Never Dies.
James Bond is on a mission which includes a media tycoon, his former lover, and a Chinese agent. Elliot Carver wants to complete his global media empire by securing the broadcasting rights in China. Carver wants to start World War III by starting a confrontation over British and Chinese waters. That is the film in a nutshell. Jay, what did you remember about this before you rewatched it recently?
I didn't remember much, to be honest, Andy, and I think it was similar to the GoldenEye, where I remembered more about the actors and actresses. So I remembered that there was Elliot Carver, and he was kind of a media mogul. I remember that there were two main Bond girls, and that was Whalen and Terry Hatcher, but I couldn't remember what Terry Hatcher's name was in the actual film. And I remembered the motorbike chase with the helicopter, but otherwise I didn't really remember much. I obviously, when I said about the media, but I couldn't remember what Elliot Carver was trying to achieve before watching it. I couldn't really remember any of the secondary villains either. So not really much, considering it's a film, from the 90s, so it's one of the later films. My memory isn't that great with GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies. What about you, Andy?
Similar to you, I didn't remember a great deal about it. I remember Terry Hatcher being in a Bond girl role, but again, didn't know in kind of what context. I knew there was something to do with the media. I didn't really remember the actual plot line as such, but I knew it was something media related. But one thing I did remember was the remote control BMW, which is, I think, one of the better Bond gadgets. Actually, it's pretty cool. We'll get into that a little bit later, but it's one that stuck out to me. But otherwise, that's pretty much it, I would say. So let's list some more information about the film. So the villains, we've got Elliot Carver, as mentioned, the media mogul. We've got Stamper. We have Henry Gupta, and we have Dr. Kaufman. And we also have three Bond girls, Whalen, Paris Carver, and Professor Inga Bergstrom.
And the theme song is sung by Sheryl Crow, and it's Tomorrow Never Dies. And the opening credits, the opening credits were very modern, and obviously we're going to rank where the opening credits, myself and Andy think they rank later on in the podcast. But at the moment, you had the X-ray effects, you've got models dressed. I put slash morphed into circuit boards. I quite like that. It reminded me, Andy, of the Terminator 2, the liquid Terminator. That kind of
the T-1000.
Yes.
The T-1000? Yeah.
Well, not Arnold Schwarzenegger, the other one.
Yeah, played by Robert Patrick, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And it kind of reminded me of that. The usual model silhouettes, but also, because it's to do with media, you had the breaking of monitors, TV screens as well. So, like a lot of the credits, if not all the credits, with the exception of some of the earlier ones, the opening credits featured elements from the actual film. And as I said, it was definitely, in my opinion, so I don't know if you have an opposite view of this, it was definitely the most modern opening credits so far in the franchise.
I would agree with that. Yeah, definitely bringing it up to date. You could tell we were in the 90s with the update of graphics.
Definitely. And the last point for me before Andy discusses the gadgets is the all-important body count. So James Bond kills 30, which we're obviously going to see where that ranks later on. That seemed a bit low compared to, it seemed a lot of people died in this film, but in terms of the official James Bond kills, there were 30.
Let's go through some gadgets. So I mentioned one earlier, but let's go through the full list. So we have a lighter that's also a bomb. We have a phone that includes a stun gun, a fingerprint scanner. We have the Omega Seamaster watch that Bond takes from the Chinese safe house, and the aforementioned remote control BMW, which is fitted out with all kinds of security features as well. So again, quite the array of gadgets for Bond to play with. The introduction, James Bond, comes after 30 minutes and 25 seconds. We do have some martini drinking, and this time around we do have some hat wearing, although not thrown in this film. So Jay, next question from me is, what was your favourite scene from this film?
Andy, there were two that jumped out for me when we were pulling together the notes. And I think for me it's a bit unusual actually, Andy, because I don't tend to pick the chase scenes. But there was two. There was the car / motorbike / helicopter chase scenes, but also the one that you mentioned about the remote control BMW chase scene, which I thought was very good and a different spin on the typical Bond chase scene with the cars. And like I said, the motorbike scene was with obviously Bond and Wei Lin. They were the two that really jumped out. And I don't always like the car scenes. Sometimes I think they might go on too long. They can be a bit repetitive, but for me, because you had a motorbike, a helicopter, it kind of freshened things up. And then the remote control element, which was, I think it was a bit funny. And I didn't remember the remote control, Andy. And when it happened, I thought of last week's episode with the avid gamer question that I threw in the quiz when I was thinking about, Pierce Brosnan being an avid gamer. And I said to the missus, I said, I said to Andy about this in the quiz. And, Bond, he could have been an avid gamer. We never know. But that was what I remembered. What about you, Andy?
I tend to agree with everything you've just said. I think those two scenes really stood out. But the motorbike chase scene just slightly edged it for me. I think it would be interesting to go back over the previous 17 episodes to see what our favourite scenes tend to involve, because I've got a feeling I've picked quite a lot of chase scenes throughout. They seem to be the ones that really stand out for me, and this had two very good scenes, but the motorbike chase scene just kind of tops my list.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely recall you picking more chase scenes compared to myself, but yeah, maybe we can do that, kind of collate, maybe in the end of season special, Andy, we can kind of just summarize all our favorite scenes.
There you go, a world exclusive for what's coming up in episode 26. So another question we're asking each week is, how many times did you reach for your phone?
So Andy, it was 0. I was very disciplined as usual. I wasn't really tempted. I thought there was a lot happening in the film, so I was very disciplined, and I've been quite consistent in terms of not reaching for my phone. What about you?
So I had one look at my phone, and for the life of me, I can't remember why that was. But I did stop at one point just to have a quick look for something. It must have been something related to what I was seeing on screen, but I didn't make a note of what it was. So apologies for my half an answer, but it was just the once.
That's still very good. I think we can obviously look through how many times we reached the phone in our special again, but I've recall it's always been less than 5. I think there was one film, and I can't remember if it was Moonraker for you, Andy, where you went on the phone a few times, but I can't remember if it was Moonraker. There was one film where I think you might have done maybe 2 or 3 at most.
Sounds about right, yeah. I guess the thing with this question is, obviously we included it as a kind of, I don't know, social experiment, I guess you call it, because nowadays it's quite prevalent when you're watching TV and film that you do just sit. I mean, I'm guilty of it a lot. I have my phone out pretty much all the time for certain things I'm watching. So maybe because we are purposefully paying attention, it's less than usual. But it's interesting to note that even when we are supposed to be, doing our research and keeping full attention, it can just wonder a bit if there are part of the films that lull, or in some cases I think it's just to find out something about what we're seeing on screen. And it's brought to mind what the one time I looked at my phone was. It was when Dr. Kaufman came on screen. I recognized him, which we'll get to the scene later, but I recognized him, and I stopped the film to Google to make sure that he was who I thought he was, and he was.
Yeah, that happens quite a lot, Andy, in terms of being on your phone, being on our phone, and the missus said the same thing when you said about the actor, and she says something like, he's been in something before, and I always do something witty. Yeah, he's an actor, so he appears in other films and TV shows, not being helpful at all. But she did go on the phone and found what film it was that she recognised him from. But going back to your point, Andy, about kind of having your phone out and watching stuff, there's kind of two different categories for me when I watch stuff. Films or TV shows where you have to pay full attention, so therefore the phone is packed away. And then there's films and TV shows where you can go on your phone and you don't really miss much. So, for example, I watched a TV program on Netflix. I think it was Dark, which is a German TV program. And I had to re-watch the first episode again because it got to the end and I was like, what's happened? And it's because I was just like on my phone. And it's one of those TV programs you have to pay attention, because there's like time jumps. There's I think there's 3 different timelines in the first season, and you have to really pay attention because it's the same characters but they're different ages. And I had to rewatch the first episode just because I wasn't paying attention on my phone, because I was on my phone all the time.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's kind of the same for me. It's either I'm really into it, so I pack the phone away, or if it's kind of a light, easy watch, so something like an NCIS Los Angeles, for example, you broadly know what's going to happen each week. There's going to be a case, they're going to solve it throughout the course of the episode, so you don't really need to pay full attention. So I'll be checking football scores or emails or whatever. But when it's something where it's either really, really enjoyable, so you just want to immerse yourself in it, or if it's a complex storyline that you have to pay attention to every part of it, that's when the phone goes away. But let's get this back on track. The all-important rating. What was this out of 10 for you?
For me, I really, really enjoyed the film. I can talk about the film a bit more, Andy, later in the episode when we do the rankings. I'm going to keep this one short and sweet, and it was 7 out of 10 for me. What about you, Andy?
6 out of 10 for me. I would say it was okay, but I was slightly disappointed. And we'll get into the reasons why a little bit later on. But yeah, it was not the strongest effort, I would say. Now, we know your wife is a Brosnan fan. She's been looking forward to these films. So what did she think of the film?
Firstly, she was on her phone a lot during this film. And I was saying to her, I said last week, you've been waiting for the Brosnan era all the way, we've been working our way through the podcast, working our way through the franchise. And the first 2 films, GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, she's been on her phone loads. But then her comeback was, it's just one of those films where you can go on your phone and you don't really miss much. But her comments were, so Andy, last week, like I said, I made a mistake where I gave her the notepad and she wrote loads and loads of stuff. This time, I said to her, when the film ended, like I said, it was late. I said, do you want to do your wife comment tomorrow when I'm doing the notes? She said, no, I'd tell you now. So it's very short and sweet. She said the franchise is very repetitive. The endings are over dramatic. The villain bases are very industrial, and she was saying always lots of metal. They're kind of secret bases or their complexes. And she said they always seem to have kind of the goons in hazmat suits. So do you know what I mean? Like she said, like big boiler suits, but she was like meaning hazmat with sometimes with the not the face mask, but the head.
And kind of like
the hoods. And can't think what the actual correct terminology is.
I don't know what they are, but I know what you mean. Yeah.
So
with the visor.
Yes. Yeah. So that was it. Very short and sweet, but she's enjoying it. But she is saying, but I think we're 18 films in. I think I don't know if you agree with this. There is repetition in an element, that generally, there's a bad guy, there's Bond, there's at least 2 different Bond girls. You're going to have your secondary villains, and the different elements of bad is like we've had megalomaniacs, we've had Spectre, haven't we? And we've had this is the first time we've had this type of villain in terms of like a modern media mogul. But there are certain repetitive or elements that are repeated throughout. But I think you're going to have that, aren't you, in a film franchise? It's like, think of the Marvel films. There's things that they do in the films each time. So for me, it's not getting boring. And like I said, I really enjoyed this film. So I don't know what your view is in terms of the being repetitive.
I think it's a very interesting point, and I can't disagree with it really. I wouldn't say repetitive in so much as it's the same thing happening all the time, but there is definitely a formula. There are definitely certain things that happen or are referenced in pretty much every film, and you know, we're talking about some of those things like the drink and the hat and the introduction. So there are certain staples of the film, and then there are certain things like the opening credits and the gun barrel, and so it follows a specific format, and that can appear to be repetitive because it follows the same format. I guess it's a double-edged sword though. If you change it too much, they lose the identity as being Bond films, and they are just films. So it's a good thing because they are identifiable as Bond films for this reason, but then also they fall into that category of maybe they are repetitive for the same reason. So it's an interesting line that they have to try and balance, I would say.
And obviously we're going to talk about the budget and box office stats in a few minutes, and we obviously track those. But obviously it's working for the producers, so they're not going to change it, are they? They're not going to do a reboot every film. They obviously have they've rebooted the franchise with Daniel Craig, and like we said last week, they've kind of done a soft reboot with Pierce Brosnan. But, you know, like you're saying, there's a formula that works. And they release a Bond film depending, obviously, they were doing it initially every year. It seems to be every 2 or 3 years at the moment in terms of where we are in the franchise. So it's not like they're dishing them out every year and people are going to get bored. Because you go to the cinema to watch them, don't you? And you don't go there thinking, oh, this is just going to be another Bond film, do you? You go there with like excitement still, and just you're looking forward to it.
A Bond film at the cinema for me is an event. You know, I don't go to the cinema very often, but since next week's film, which we'll talk about next week, is the first one I saw at the cinema, and then I've been to every one since. So I was 15 when The World Is Not Enough came out, and I'm now slightly older than 15, and it's still just as exciting now for me as it was then.
Yeah, hence why we're doing the podcast.
Indeed. No surprise that my wife didn't partake, but she's still on the hook for No Time to Die. I'll try and maybe sneak another Craig film in as well, but we're good for one at least. So I will keep you posted if that changes. Let's get a little bit deeper into the film now. So some of the facts. This has a runtime of 1 hour 59 minutes. So this is again in the ballpark of all the rest, but probably on the shorter side of things. It feels like this is the first one in quite some time that's gone under 2 hours. So I'd say this is one of the shorter ones. Released in 1997 and directed by Roger Spottiswoode.
So we're just going to talk about some of the general points now before we kind of get into a bit deeper into the film. So as always, I like to kick this section off with the budget and box office stats. So in terms of the budget, this is, I feel like I'm saying this every week now, Andy. This is the most expensive Bond film so far, and the budget for Tomorrow Never Dies was $110 million, and that's a massive increase of $50 million compared to GoldenEye, which came out 2 years ago, 2 years before this, Tomorrow Never Dies. And therefore, it's the first time in the franchise where the budget has exceeded the $100 million mark in terms of the budget, which is a significant point, really. In terms of how did that translate in terms of the box office stats? So it made 339.5 million worldwide, and when you adjust that in today's money, in terms of dollars, it equates to around $605 million. So it did well. So that means Tomorrow Never Dies did make less than GoldenEye, but only by $17 million. So for the production team, that's pocket money, Andy. Pocket change, really, isn't it, for that kind of numbers, really. So we're going to talk about where that drops in the rankings later on. But I think that's a good return, Andy. 110 million budget, and they're bringing back, was that nearly 3 times the amount?
Just slightly over 3 times, yeah. I don't know if I read this recently or if this just sticks in my mind, but wasn't this also released around the same time as Titanic? Or certainly in a similar time, certainly the same year, but I think it might have been a similar time frame as well.
I believe so. I'm nodding, sorry, Andy, and that's not beneficial to our listeners.
Jay is nodding. Which, you know, is there's competition, and then there's competition. Titanic, as we know, went on to be one of the, if you know, it's probably still in the top 5, top 10 most successful films of all time. Was just a huge moneymaker. So for Bond to come up against competition like that and still get a performance that was comparable with GoldenEye, I think is a pretty good effort.
I agree. And we've obviously spoken about when Timothy Dalton's, I think it was License to Kill, we mentioned in the podcast episodes the films that you know the Bond was against then obviously had an impact on their box office performance. But yeah, you could say what ifs, you know, was it out around the same time, or was it out in the, you know, that year, that month? We could obviously find out. But yeah, how much of an impact did it have? And obviously we're going to talk later on where it actually dropped in on the you know, the box office rankings. But no, that's a good point there, Andy, about Titanic. Moving on, one last point for me before passing over to Andy was the script was incomplete when filming actually began. And as part of the research, Andy, on this, I've read a couple of articles about how stressful that made certain actors in terms of actually filming the scenes, because the script wasn't ready. There were rewrites, things changing. So there was some stressful actors.
Yeah, I can imagine that could be quite tough. Just kind of sidebar, because when I saw this line in the notes, it brought to mind something that my dad and I spoke about recently. So he's a big fan of Charlie Chaplin, and he was watching a documentary about Chaplin, and there was a film that he made that the name escapes me in terms of what it is, but there was a scene he was trying to film whereby he was buying flowers from a flower girl in the street, and she was blind, and he wanted a way to kind of get out that she was, you know, she was blind, but you don't necessarily know it straight away. And eventually they settled on some kind of thing where the car pulls up and she hears the door slam, and she thinks that Charlie Chaplin is gone. He's gone in the car, even though he stood there. But what was interesting about that, and why this kind of brought it to mind, was he couldn't figure out that part of the scene, so he halted production, but kept everyone involved with the film on the payroll whilst he went away to think about it. And it took him over a year to come up with the next part of the scene, so he just had to keep paying people to do nothing for over a year. And I thought that was quite an interesting little tidbit that just kind of came to mind with your note there.
I've never seen a Charlie Chaplin film, Andy.
I probably have as a kid. I wouldn't say silent cinema is really my bag. But my dad is very old. He's older than you, Jay. So, you know, he's into that kind of thing. The film was originally titled Tomorrow Never Lies, a reference to Elliot Carver's newspaper Tomorrow. However, it was the subject of a typo, and the producers liked this alternate title so much that they adopted it as the final title. And also, this is the final Bond film to date that's been released through United Artists. UA parent company Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer would assume co-production and distribution beginning with the next film of the franchise. A couple of other notes. This is the first Bond film where Bond switches to the new Walther P99 until Daniel Craig appeared and reverted back to the Walther PPK in the pre-credit scenes. And finally, Roger Spottiswoode was invited back to direct the following film, The World Is Not Enough. However, he turned down the opportunity due to exhaustion.
Andy, Tomorrow Never Lies or Tomorrow Never Dies? Did they make the right choice?
I think they made the right choice.
I do. Yeah.
I understand why it was originally called that, having watched the film, but Tomorrow Never Dies is more of a Bond title, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely more
Just
fitting.
sounds better, yeah.
The Reading Room.
So moving on to our another usual segment is the goofs and continuity errors, and we've only got one apiece this week. So there's obviously there might be other ones that listeners, viewers might pick up, and feel free to let us know on our social media accounts. But we've just included 2 this week, so I'm going to kick us off. In the BMW chase scene, the back window is clearly blown out. However, as the camera goes back on Bond, it is intact, and then missing as a rocket launcher goes cleanly through moments later.
So I've got another science one. When the stealth ship tries to escape the English and Chinese navies, it's said to be going at 48 knots. But when we see it speeding away, you can see by its wake that it's actually cruising quite slowly. So it's definitely nowhere near 48 knots. So one for our science fans out there.
We've had back-to-back episodes, Andy, where we're talking about a little bit of science or physics, mathematics.
I feel like it's our duty to educate the people. We're more than entertainers, we're educators.
My kids asked me the other day if I could homeschool them so they didn't have to go to school, and I said I'm not clever enough to homeschool you.
Well, maybe homeschooling should involve listening to this podcast. It's 2 science lessons at least we've got going on. You've obviously got your maths with your budget talks. You love the cash. We butcher the English language on a regular basis, so they'll know what not to do. So there's your core subjects covered right there.
But we'd fail. I couldn't do PE, Andy. Last week, when I said I'd get the stuntman to do all the running for me, so I couldn't do the PE lessons.
Yeah, we'd stick to theory only, I think, in that case, rather than actual PE. Should we get into the film proper?
The Reading Room.
We'll start with the opening sequence, obviously the gun barrel. So this was mentioned in last week's episode. The sequence is the same gun barrel from GoldenEye, and it's also used in the following film, World Is Not Enough. Question I had though, it's different music, isn't it? Didn't sound the same to me.
It is different music, Andy. So I checked that after I saw your note, and it was... We're going to talk about David Arnold soon, but yeah, it was David Arnold that put the music to this. So you're correct, and it is better, isn't it?
Miles better, I thought. I really didn't like it from last week, but this week it felt not like they'd gone backwards, but they'd gone back to how it should be. It felt right.
So we're into the opening scene now, and this is done at an arms dealer base. So we hear that White Knight, aka Bond, is in a position, and Charles Robinson, so he's a new character, comes out with a brilliant quote that includes the line, it's like a terrorist supermarket. And that made me chuckle, Andy. So I know quite juvenile, but where there's a bit more to that scene where he's talking about various missiles, artillery, weapons, etc., and then he just throws in there, it's like a terrorist supermarket. So that did make me chuckle. And then I just started thinking, wonder that's how terrorists do it, where they just kind of go on to, well, I suppose it's all online now, Andy. They don't have to go out in the middle of some place in Russia to go and buy their weapons. They'll probably do it on some kind of black market site.
Probably could do some sort of click and collect, but would that be click, click, boom and collect? This is lowering the tone.
So getting back to Charles Robinson. So this is the first of 3 Bond films that Colin Salmon plays MI6 Deputy Chief of Staff Charles Robinson. And I thought he was in more Bond films, but obviously he's not. Originally, Charles Robinson was intended as a replacement for the character of Bill Tanner, who we discussed last week, when Michael Kitchen was unavailable to reprise his role from GoldenEye. However, since his performance in Tomorrow Never Dies, he went on to appear in 3 consecutive films as a regular. But like I said, it just felt he was in more Bond films, but obviously he wasn't. So the 3 films, that would have been all the next Brosnan films, wasn't it?
I believe so, yeah. So it'd been in this, in World Is Not Enough, and then Die Another Day.
Yeah, so he would have come out before Daniel Craig taking over, before the reboot.
And a note on Colin Salmon. British bookmakers at one point stopped taking bets on Salmon becoming the new Bond. It repeatedly received the backing of Pierce Brosnan. Ultimately, he lost out to Daniel Craig when Bond was recast in Casino Royale. But I think Salmon would have made a good Bond, actually.
I do, and I remembered where he was linked to James Bond, before Daniel Craig got it. And I was thinking, when we were typing up these notes, I was thinking, if he took over from Bond, was that going to be kind of a way that they could explain to viewers how James Bond could be replaced? So he wouldn't necessarily be James Bond. He would transition into 007 and then kind of carry on. And then when he eventually left, they could get someone else in and he was 007. Do you know what I mean? In terms of how they can continue the story of 007, but not necessarily James Bond. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think what that does, though, is it makes these 007 films as opposed to James Bond films. So then what you'd end up with is a 007 film without the character James Bond, potentially. And I think that might be too much for people to handle. I think there could be outcry about that. But I like the thinking. And I actually wonder whether him being in the 3 Bond films was actually a detriment. And if he'd not appeared in this and the subsequent 2, whether that could have actually helped his chances of becoming Bond when Brosnan left the role.
Yeah, I agree. But I don't really recall him in much else. But he's obviously got on the radar doing this role. But I agree, yeah, completely. It's probably gone against him. If they wanted to continue the James Bond bits, which I totally get from your point of view, and a lot of diehard fans, this is a James Bond franchise and not a 007 franchise. I'm just thinking, we can obviously talk about it in episode 25. I'm just thinking of how they're going to do the future Bonds, and this could have been a little way where they could have done that and then kind of put that into bed, when Daniel Craig left, and they could, because Colin Salmon, when he took over, he inherited 007, but he's not James Bond. And then if he left, dies, or whatever, in terms of the Bond franchise later on, Joe Bloggs come in, picks up the mantle of 007. Whereas now, we're talking about, when we talk about the last episode, it's what did he do going on in James Bond?
No, it's a good point. And in terms of what else he's been in, I can't think of anything else other than he did Strictly Come Dancing a few years ago. And if memory serves me correctly, he did one of his dances to the James Bond theme.
Oh, nice. I don't watch that program, so I will have to take your word for it, Andy.
We could maybe do a season on it of the podcast if you want.
No, Andy, but, if this podcast ever takes off, Andy, and we become successful, obviously Strictly have celebs and sportsmen, etc., and you obviously have a dancing background, so you'll be a hot favourite, surely, for a future season.
I mean, I would hope so. And when you say dancing background, what you actually mean is I've done a few dance lessons and performed at a very, very poor level. I've never performed in public or in competition because I'm just not very good. But yeah, Strictly Come Dancing. I'm open to offers. And Richard Osman's House of Games. I'd love to do that as well. So there you go. If you're listening, Richard, I'm available for a very small fee.
Can you make sure it's 100,000 so Andy does the bungee jump off the dam, please?
That's a nice callback there. It'd be worth it. I'll tell you what. If Richard Osman ever invites me on his show for any amount of money, I'll do the bungee jump. There you go. You heard it here first. We should probably get back on track. So back to the film. We see Henry Gupta for the first time. He's described as a techno-terrorist, which is quite an interesting description. And we've got some hidden cameras at the base, and they give M and Co. multiple angles, and I wonder how did they get there, and why so many. Like, I don't know if this is a feed that already exists that they've tapped into, but it looked to me like they were planted there. But if you're doing a multiple camera setup in secret, that seems a little bit over the top to me.
Yeah, I don't think, because you can imagine Bond just kind of going around and just dropping them off, setting them up, and then walking to the next bit. I suppose if the film was done now, you could have had drones, couldn't you, in the sky at a distance to cover all the angles instead of little potential mobile cameras that he's stored. Little kind of GoPros dotted around. Carrying on, we're introduced to Admiral Roebuck in this scene as well, and he orders a naval strike on the arms dealer base. However, thanks to Bond, MI6 spots that there's a nuclear missile at the base, and Bond has just over 4 minutes to get out of there.
Roebuck to me just seemed like he wasn't listening to M, and I got the impression he was being quite misogynist, just kind of, talking down to her because she's a woman. That's the vibe I got from this scene.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think we wrote this down, Andy. She makes a quip, doesn't she, about where, I can't remember, was it her that was it M that said something about not having balls, but at least I don't think with them, or something like along the lines of that, wasn't it? Which I thought was a good little quip.
Yeah, I think did Roebuck say you've not got the balls for this? And she responded with, well, at least I don't think with mine, or something.
Yeah. So she I think that was good. Admiral Roebuck is played by Geoffrey Palmer, who starred opposite Dame Judi Dench in the TV show As Time Goes By, which I remember watching that as a kid with my parents, Andy. So I don't know if it's a TV show you watched.
One I'm vaguely familiar with, I would say. But it was good to see the double act back on screen. And I'd actually forgotten that Geoffrey Palmer was in this, so that was a nice little surprise. There was a good part where Bond lights the cigarette for a goon who's kind of looking the opposite way, and then he realises it's Bond. And then Bond, I think he knocks him out and follows it up with the line, "Filthy habit." And that immediately made me think of the quiz from last week, where you included the anti-smoking ambassador or whatever it was.
Yes, anti-tobacco.
As one of your BS lines.
Yeah. No, that was good, Andy. I didn't pick that up. I thought it was funny as well, where he punched him and said, like, filthy habit. I did think that was funny. And it just goes back to, I think I said last week, the Brosnan Bond. I know we're only 2 films deep. Well, we're like a film in 5-10 minutes. He definitely comes across as the wittier Bond. You could argue Roger Moore was as well, but it just seems the Brosnan version is very witty.
I think you're right. I think the Roger Moore Bond there was a lot of one-liners, but most of them seemed to be innuendo, like exclusively. Whereas I think Brosnan just has a more natural-sounding wit just about any situation, not just the innuendo. It just seems to have a one-liner for every occasion.
Yeah, definitely. So moving on. So just before Bond manages to get to the fighter plane, there's a bit where I don't know what the technical term is, but like magnetic bombs that he's dotting about. And did you see the one where he puts a bomb on, but it's actually shaped like a grenade? But it's not a grenade, it's like a magnet one, like a fridge magnet, but in a grenade type thing. So he manages to get to the fighter plane, and then he's, like I said, he's setting off explosions as well. He's just making his way across the base, and then Bond shoots up the place with the fighter plane with the machine guns, and I think there's some rockets as well from memory. But I thought this whole scene and the bit where he escapes with like a fireball was really good special effects, and it reminded me of GoldenEye, where you were saying last week it's like a step up GoldenEye. And I don't know, it's just in terms of the advancement in technology. We're in the 90s now compared to the 60s, 70s and 80s, and like I said last week, I don't know, it's because we grew up with these kind of Brosnan films. So they say, don't they, when you're born and that technology that's around there, you're just used to it. I'm just thinking that my kids are just used to that mobile phones and stuff like that. And obviously, when we were younger, we didn't have mobile phones. And I think it was good special effects. And it was really noticeable at the beginning where the plane flies off. Massive explosion where the naval ship missile hits and you got your big fireball. But I thought it was really good special effects. And that's all just within the first 5-10 minutes of the opening scene.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the step up is noticeable. And probably not only technology of the time, but it might explain the huge increase in budget as well, because they're going all out for this kind of thing. But yeah, I agree. Very, very good looking scene that was. There's a bit of a funny moment during the opening where Bond is in fighter jet, and there's a co-pilot behind him who I think he knocked out earlier or he punched earlier and then starting to come to. So he uses the ejector seat to launch the co-pilot that sat behind him, but there's a fighter jet above, and the pilot from Bond's fighter jet goes flying up into the jet above, and I thought that was quite amusing in terms of how that worked. And then to finish this scene off, we see Bond attempting to take off, but then one of the goons is in another fighter jet facing directly towards him, and we have a very, very expensive game of chicken before Bond makes his escape. And then that takes us into the opening title sequence of music.
I was just checking my quiz because I read something and I'm just making sure I've not put it in my quiz, just bear with me. Yeah, I definitely. So, did you know, Andy, in terms of that opening scene with all the missiles and everything, I don't know how many of them, but that scene actually had at least one real missile that they transported all the way from Russia to where they actually filmed that scene.
That seems ludicrous and unnecessary, I would say. Well, why would you risk that?
Yeah, feel free, any listeners, to fact check me and let me know if I've got that wrong. But yeah, I did read that and I didn't include it in the notes actually, but it just prompted me that it was something I read. So yeah, feel free to challenge me on that if that is not true. That is definitely something I read though. And yeah, it doesn't make sense because they transported it all the way from Russia, and I can't remember where this scene was actually filmed. So they transported it from Russia to here, and it was an actual missile. Hopefully it wasn't a nuclear one, Andy.
I think we'd have probably heard about it if it was, so let's take the assumption. Or maybe we wouldn't. Maybe it's the world's biggest cover-up. Who knows? But that's an interesting factoid you've got there. Let's get into the next part, which is the opening title sequence of music. John Barry was approached to return to the franchise. It had been a decade since Barry had worked on Bond previously. However, Barry and the producers couldn't agree on his salary. So Barry recommended David Arnold to Barbara Broccoli. He'd heard Arnold's successful Shaken and Stirred, the David Arnold James Bond project, which is Bond title scenes with new arrangements and a modern twist.
Yeah, so this was David Arnold's first full Bond soundtrack, but David Arnold went on to score five Bond films in total. And the year before, David Arnold had scored the soundtrack for Independence Day, which is obviously a massive Will Smith film. And he's also scored several other films, including Stargate, which is an absolute classic, Godzilla, and that was a 1990s Godzilla, not the one that's came out in the last few years, Zoolander, which is not a film I like, Andy. I don't know if you like Zoolander, and Hot Fuzz. So Andy is shaking his head. He's not a fan of Zoolander. I can't get on with Zoolander. And Hot Fuzz, which is a Simon Pegg film. Simon Pegg. I was going to say Sean Bean, and I think I had it on my head from GoldenEye. So Sean Bean making an appearance.
He did Shaun of the Dead. Maybe that's what
you're thinking of. Yeah, a good film, Shaun of the Dead. So the original soundtrack doesn't feature any of the music from the final third of the actual film due to the hectic scoring schedule. But interestingly, a second soundtrack was released a few years later, so 3 years later, with the additional music, but actually minus the two main songs and two further tracks, which included one of the Moby remixes that wasn't on the second soundtrack.
Yeah, also originally Arnold, Don Black and David McCallum wrote the theme song. However, MGM MGM wanted a popular artist, invited singers to write the theme song, and they had around a dozen submissions. And they had songs from Pulp, from St. Etienne, from Swan Lee, and of course Sheryl Crow. Sheryl Crow, for those who are not in the know, sold more than 50 million albums worldwide, won 9 Grammy Awards, and the Tomorrow Never Dies theme song was actually nominated for a Grammy Award in the Best Song Written Specifically for a Motion Picture or TV category. That's a bit of a tongue twister, but sadly lost out to Titanic for My Heart Will Go On by Celine Dion. And in the end titles, just a bit of a jumping forward, K.D. Lang sings the song Surrender. Now originally Surrender was intended to be the film's main theme song, and you can hear the melody of it throughout the film. However, it was moved to the end and Sheryl Crow's was chosen as the main theme song.
Up until now, this is the only Bond film to feature 2 genuine theme songs. So we're going to skip now a few different, so we're going to be in the HMS Devonshire, we're going to be at Carver's Place and the stealth ship, so we're just going to skip between these scenes. So an alarm goes off on the HMS Devonshire and everyone goes to the action stations, and you also see the Chinese pilots warn the British ship. We see Gupta working on a computer and Stamper is on the stealth ship, so we obviously saw Gupta at the beginning at the arms dealer place, but this is the first time we're seeing Stamper. We'll also see Elliot Carver for the first time as well, and Carver is played by Jonathan Pryce.
Pryce has got quite the resume. Began his career with stage work, was later knighted by Queen Elizabeth II for his services to drama. He's won 2 Olivier Awards, 2 Tony Awards, that's for his work on Hamlet, Miss Saigon and Comedians. And he's also featured in several films, including Brazil, Evita, and the Pirates of the Caribbean film series, as well as a number of TV roles with Game of Thrones, Tales from the Loop, and he's soon to be playing Prince Philip in The Crown.
So we see a formidable drilling machine. We see a formidable drilling missile being launched from the stealth ship, and it's being operated by the remote control, and it creates havoc aboard the ship here. And the wife commented when this was happening, it was like a shark, and I thought it was interesting, Andy, where you didn't see it necessarily move up and down, but you can just imagine that, because usually, missiles hit the side of the ship and then cause an explosion and an opening in the ship, but this one was drilling in, and then obviously it was maneuvering in its way to get to the missile room, wasn't it, so that the enemies could do what they wanted to do in there.
Yeah, it was quite a nice feature. I originally thought Dr. Robotnik, from Sonic the Hedgehog, kind of reminded me, because he has some sort of like drill attachment when you play hit against him as a boss. I had a note here around the scene. So there's some Chinese fighter pilots that are kind of basically warning the ship because they're in Chinese territorial waters, and then this happens with the drilling missile that causes the havoc that you mentioned, and they must have been thinking to themselves, like, why are they sinking themselves? Because they were threatening action, but they never got round to taking any action before the ship started sinking. So that must have been a bit of a mind trip for them.
Yeah, they're probably thinking, poor British engineering, the ship is sinking. But in this scene, Andy, and I was surprised, we see a young Gerard Butler. And this was Gerard Butler's second movie. So I was surprised when his face came up on the screen. The crew have to evacuate the British ship, and the baddies shoot down one of the Chinese jets as well, just for good measures. And Stamper then kills all of and I think it was 17 survivors. Feel free to correct me, Andy. I think it was. Yeah, Andy's nodding. While they're filming it as well. And then Stamper says, I think he radios Carver, and he says that they've completed phase 1. So Carver then has a conference call as well with the different heads of, I'd say, not departments, but the maybe stations throughout the world. So he's got a conference call here, and this scene includes a bit about releasing software with bugs and keeping customers updating for years, which I think was a dig at Microsoft, and also having some dirt on the president as well. And he says something about getting the president to sign some kind of legislation, and then he says something like release the tape anyway, doesn't he? And it's something about slime, I think. I can't quite remember the quote. But
was he filmed with a cheerleader or something?
Yes. We've all been there, so yes.
You heard it here first. Rating Room podcast host in cheerleader scandal. That will be the next headline. I made a note here about this conference call. Carver was very out of breath. I didn't know if it was like a nerves thing, but it's not like, he's doing any heavy lifting. So what, is he like just come from the gym? Has he ran up the stairs? But he's in a room talking to people on a video screen, and he sounds knackered. Like, what's that all about?
Yeah, I remember this, Andy, when I saw your note, and I remember thinking he came across. I don't think giddy is the right word. He just don't think he's going to be intimidating to Bond. And I don't think the word is giddy, Andy, but I can't think of the best word to use here. But I get your point. He was maybe he was like excited. He's just come down on Christmas Day and he's seen all his presents and he's thinking, "Oh, I've just completed phase 1, amazing!" And he's just so giddy about it and just excited. And he needs like an inhaler or something, to calm him down.
Yeah, he needed a little bit more composure, didn't he? Just calm yourself. You're leading a global media empire. You need to just take a step back.
Imagine how he gets with Paris, because she's a good-looking girl. If he's like that every night with her,
he'd be really out of breath with her. That's for sure. Speaking of which, let's move on to the next scene. So we're at Oxford University, and we see Bond and Professor Inga Bergstrom in bed. You don't need me to explain what they're doing. But they're interrupted when Moneypenny phones Bond about the incident in China. And there's a bit of banter between the two. And then Moneypenny calls Bond a cunning linguist. And that's got to be the rudest innuendo between the two, hasn't it? Because, I mean, they always have minor flirtations. But that kind of took me a little bit by surprise, that one day. That's kind of, that's a bit much for Moneypenny and Bond.
I must admit, Andy, that went over my head in terms of I didn't pick that up. I don't know if I was just tuned out, because I have banter a lot. It was only when I was reading your note there that I did have a chuckle to myself, but I missed that originally.
That's why we work so well together. We spot the things that the others don't. But I did make a note here that it is good to see that Bond's expanding his language set. This time practicing a little bit of Danish.
Yeah, indeed. I thought that as well. We're jumping from Oxford now, and we are back at, I don't know if it's MI6, but I don't know, was it MI6? We're back at some British intelligence or British operation base, and we're seeing the conflict between M and Admiral Roebuck as well. And M is very strong and witty, and I kind of mentioned that earlier as well in terms of the Balls comment. But we see Bond is given 48 hours to investigate before the British naval fleet arrives as well. So he's got 48 hours to investigate. And the Bond and Moneypenny and M, and I think, is Charles Robinson in the car here? I can't quite remember. But they're kind of talking about the mission, and M and Moneypenny even tease Bond about pumping Miss Carver for information, which I thought was quite funny. And, we're having some innuendos already, aren't we, at the beginning of Tomorrow Never Dies. And they also let Bond know that they know that he used to be romantically involved as well with Paris Carver, which, Andy, actually, that reminds me of something which I didn't write down. Originally, before they did the Paris Carver character, they did think about having a Bond girl from one of the previous films. So, for example, Anya, the one from the Spy Who Loved Me, and another one they mentioned, but they decided not to do it because obviously we're going to talk about it, and we're assuming, listeners, you've watched the film, but they didn't want to bring someone back just to kill him later on in a few scenes, so that's why they made this new character. But they did originally think, let's bring back a previous Bond girl, so the viewer will know that he's obviously been romantically involved with someone that but because of they didn't want to kill someone off that had previously survived, they just made up this new character.
That may have worked, but you're right. There's obviously something going on, and I think it's more than just a one night stand. That's the implication here. But we're off to Hamburg next, and Q is in Germany, so we see him for the first time. They've got a bit of an interaction regarding car insurance, which we'll go through later in the episode. But it's quite a funny little back and forth. Q's looking very old now, has to be said. I think this might have been a note that you originally made, but I fully concur with. And I don't know how old he would have been at the time of this. Maybe I'll do some live Googling.
I Googled this, Andy, and
okay.
I don't think what I found is wrong. It can't be. So let me know what you find, because I use mathematics to calculate it, and maths isn't my strong point. So it can't be what I found. But basically, I worked it out with some maths, got the answer that I didn't expect, and I thought, sod it, and move on.
So go on, give me how old do you think he was at the time?
I think I worked it out that it was something like 58, 59.
I see. I've got it worked out that he would have been. Let's do some quick math. Drop the 2 there. 83 at the time of release.
So he obviously doesn't look nowhere near 58, or he's been, Q has been spending a lot of, he's been living the high life when he's been off site out of Q branch. But that definitely rings a bell.
Desmond Llewellyn. We'll probably talk about Llewellyn in a near future episode, but according to Wikipedia, which of course is the best source of information on the internet because anyone can edit it, so you get multiple viewpoints. 12th of September 1914 he was born, so yeah, he would have been 83 at the time of the film's release. And yeah, he's looking every day of it, has to be said. But anyway, Q shows Bond the new BMW, goes through all the extras, talks about how it can be remote controlled using the mobile phone gadget. Q has a go at demonstrating this, and it's obviously something difficult, says it takes time to learn. Up steps Bond, who of course demonstrates his driving skills, and ends with the car zooming towards Bond and Q and stopping just in front of them both. And Q ends it with saying something along the lines of, "Grow up, 007," which kind of brings back memories of previous interactions with the likes of Connery and Moore, where he's kind of getting tired of their childish antics. And for anyone who keeps note of my geekiness by remembering number plates, I took note of this one as well as soon as I saw it. The BMW number plate this time is BMT 2144. Now, listeners from last week will remember that I noted BMT 214A, and I read that for GoldenEye they wanted to use the same number plate as the car from Goldfinger, but they couldn't because someone had bought that particular Aston Martin, and in British law you can't have two cars with the same registration, so it was actually a legal reason why they couldn't keep the same number plates, hence why they went for something that was very similar. I guess they were hoping that people like me wouldn't notice these minor details and just assume it was the same, but there you go.
Thank you, Andy. So if we did homeschooling, you could do stuff about cars,
specifically number plates, and
not
much else.
How to change a tyre.
Take it to someone who knows how to fit tyres.
So moving on, Bond goes to Carver's Do, and we meet Wei Lin for the first time, and Michelle Yeoh plays Wei Lin, and Yeoh performed her own stunts in several Hong Kong action films, including Police Story 3 and Holy Weapon. And Yeoh has featured in a number of successful movies, including both of the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon films, Kung Fu Panda, Memoirs of a Geisha, and Crazy Rich Asians. And I've seen most of those films, Andy, on there. I haven't seen Memoirs of a Geisha, but I've seen the others. And Star Trek fans will also know her from her time on Star Trek Discovery. And my last point is Yeoh is currently working on Avatar 2, 3 and 4.
Talk about multitasking, 3 sequels at once. She was also nominated for the MTV Movie Award for Best Fight for The Tomorrow Never Dies, but lost out to Will Smith for his fight against Edgar Bug in Men in Black. She wanted to perform her own stunts, but was prevented from doing this because the director thought it was too dangerous, which is quite interesting there, because I'm sure you just said earlier she performed her own stunts in other films, so she's clearly capable.
So Andy, I must hold my hands up here, because as part of the research process that we do, we use various different websites, and I've found conflicting stories here. So some websites state she did her own stunts on Bond, and other websites say she didn't do her stunts because basically the director said it was too dangerous and they couldn't get what obviously it meant in terms of the assurance would be higher in terms of the premium. So there are conflicting stories out there. So I don't know if there's any listeners out there that could actually point us into it, or even better, if we can get an interview with her ourselves, Andy, and we can get it from the horse's mouth, as they say.
At this point, Bond ends up going to meet Paris Carver. Now, Paris Carver is played by Terry Hatcher. You may know Hatcher from her work as Lois Lane on Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman, and also for playing Susan Meyer on Desperate Housewives. She was in over 250 episodes for these two shows alone.
I remember her as Lois Lane, Andy, but I've never seen Desperate Housewives, so I can't comment on that. So Hatcher's acting success is mostly seen on the small screen. She has done films, including the 80s classic Tango and Cash, and also Spy Kids, and obviously Tomorrow Never Dies. And for a role in Desperate Housewife, Hatcher's won a Golden Globe Award and 3 Screen Actor Guild Awards as well. So she's obviously got a lot of success in the small screen. Terry Hatcher's scenes had to be filmed quickly because she found out she was pregnant a few days after she got the part. And apparently Terry Hatcher accepted the role of Paris Carver simply to fulfill her husband's dream of being married to a Bond girl. Is that your dream, Andy, to be married to a Bond girl?
Depends on the Bond girl. We'll have to revisit the rankings and I'll take my pick. Absolutely. I thought she looked pregnant as well. Hatcher later said she regretted playing Paris Carver, saying, and this is a quote, "It's such an artificial kind of character to be playing that you don't get any special satisfaction from it," which is quite a damning indictment, really, of Bond girl. I would have thought she would have loved the role and jumped. She's clearly jumped at the chance to play it in the first place. So a bit disappointing to hear her say she regretted it.
Andy, and I don't think we covered Terry Hatcher in our episode on Bond girls, did we? Because obviously we mentioned on there about some of the experiences that some of the actresses encountered, or similar in the vein that Terry Hatcher mentioned there.
Yeah, I don't remember her taking part in the documentary, so maybe that's why we glossed over her a little bit, and as did the documentary makers, seemingly as well. But back to this film. Carver and Wei Lin meet up with Bond and Paris. Paris is very sassy when Wei Lin is introduced, and Elliot mentions about getting Wei Lin to work at the Chinese studio. Bond's got some more of his witty one-liners, and he barely disguises the fact that he's implying things about the earlier incident with the battleship. He's been, dare I say, a little bit too obvious here. He's not doing a great job of maintaining cover.
No, he's not being very covert at all, is he there? Carver then goes off, doesn't he, to do his presentation, and Bond and Wei Lin are walking down to go and watch Carver do his big spiel. And they're talking, Wei Lin and Bond, and he mentions that he's into hostile takeovers, which is a little nod. I wonder at this point, Andy, because obviously we find out Wei Lin works for the Chinese equivalent, whether she knew about Bond, because as we know earlier on in the Rating Room podcast season, everyone knows who Bond is. You know, his face has appeared on the front of newspapers and everyone knows about him. So I wonder at this point, does Wei Lin know that Bond isn't really a banker? I said banker. And, you know, she's just playing along.
It's an interesting question. I think a more interesting question is, why doesn't Elliot Carver know who he is? Because he's been on the front of newspapers, and this is a newspaper mogul. Surely he would have sight of that Maybe he would have ran a story in his early journalistic career on Bond. Who knows?
That's a very good point, Andy. I didn't pick that up, but yeah. So we then see Bond is led away by some guards who then proceed to beat Bond up in a soundproof room, which I thought was quite funny because you've got another security guard kind of watching Carver's presentation in the other room, and then Bond manages to get the upper hand, and I think he dispatches 4 or 5 guards in this bit, and then he then basically turns off all the TV equipment, which shuts down Carver's broadcast. And then Carver is he's on stage and he's having like a little strop, and then he sacks the I put down presenter, I'll say / PR lady. I don't know whether she gets a name in this bit, but I thought he was very stroppy there.
Yeah, he had a proper meltdown, didn't he? I thought this particular fight scene was quite weak. A little bit too much played for laughs. I think there was use of various musical instruments in the background. Yeah, just I don't know. It didn't do it for me, this one.
It's like I said last week. I think the Brosnan films feel quite self-aware, so they play up to the gags, the innuendos, witty one-liners, and the whole Bond girl bit as well. And maybe this fight scene is a little bit like that. They're just doing, and like the gadgets and everything just feels, maybe that's playing into it. And I suppose the last point for me, Andy, is I said he's very stroppy, but he's also I say he's quite unhinged here as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Power mad, I would say, at this stage. A little bit later on, we see Bond waiting in his hotel room. He's drinking vodka neat. Paris arrives and she seduces him. And Terry Hatcher is looking mighty, mighty fine here, if I do say so myself. I made a note as well during this scene, and it's something I noticed in GoldenEye, in his scenes with Xenia Onatopp. Bond is a biter. Like, when he goes to kiss, he tends to bite their lip, and then he was biting her shoulder at one point. He's a kinky bugger.
You would think, when you think about Bond as a lover, you would have said Sean Connery's version would have been the rougher type of Bond, but maybe Brosnan is giving him a run for his money.
Yeah, and also, is it smart for him to be a biter? Because if they find evidence and use dental records, he's going to be implicated in all kinds of things. But anyway, we see Elliot Carver. He's watching the security camera of Bond in Paris, and he's not happy. And he says something about getting the doctor in, which we'll find out soon enough what that means. Bond infiltrates Carver's building via the roof, breaks into the safe, and he finds the decoder in the red box. And as Bond is about to escape, he crosses paths with Wei Lin, and then chased around by security guards. It was a good scene, this was.
It is a good scene, and it's funny, isn't it, where she obviously broke in as well, but Bond was basically going to escape, wasn't he, without being caught. He goes to the door though because he hears someone coming in who turns out to be Wei Lin, and then all the security guards basically chase him, even though he's going to make his way out, but he's only got caught. Well, he's only got seen because of the Wei Lin part of the break-in. So I thought that was quite funny. The one thing I noticed, Andy, was, I know I mentioned it in GoldenEye as well. He says a lot of one-liners in the film already, and I don't know in terms of what minute we're at. But it just feels that there's a lot of one-liners, and it's just really obvious as well. And the note I made here, and I think I said it, Andy, last week, was Brosnan must have the most one-liners in the franchise. It's just really, really obvious.
Yeah, they're coming thick and fast. They're quite quick fire. So I would be surprised if he's not top of the list.
So Bond manages to escape, and he receives a phone call from Carver. So he's in a car and he's escaping, who says to Bond that he has 2 things that belong to him, the red box and Paris. And I think Carver even says Paris is in your bed in your hotel room, something like that. I think he actually explicitly says that. And then we shortly see that Paris is dead in Bond's bed, covered in bite marks, probably.
Could well be, yeah. dental records galore to be found there. I made a note here that Bond showed some real emotion. Quite rare for him to do this, particularly Brosnan's portrayal, what we've seen so far. And this just kind of emphasised what I thought earlier, that she was clearly more than just another conquest for him. No, this wasn't a one-night stand. This was clearly a meaningful relationship that the two had in the past.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Andy. And just before I move on to my point, because they've been romantically involved before, I wonder when they've been romantically involved before and how their paths cross. Because I don't recall them discussing how they met. I know she uses a bit of a cover story to Carver to say that Bond dated a roommate at university, I think it was. I can't quite remember. But I don't think it explicitly says when they were dating, because I can't imagine Bond meeting her on another mission.
No, I agree. Yeah, she said something about dating her roommate in Zurich, I think it was. Obviously, there must be, I assume, a number of years have passed, because obviously Paris has remarried. Well, she's not remarried. She has met someone and their relationship's blossomed to the point of marriage. So that's got to be some time at least. But if it's not on a mission, are we talking James Bond getting a day off? Does that happen, or is he constantly on the job, so to speak, and not just in that way? Clearly, when he's not on the job, he's still on the job.
Yeah, I don't know, and I don't know whether it's explained in the book. I'm not too sure. But last point, Andy, and we've mentioned this before I don't think we've mentioned it for quite a while now, so it's earlier on in our podcast season. Paris is the 11th woman that Bond fails to protect from death. So maybe he's not just showing some real emotion. It's like, oh no, that's 11 that's died now, where I failed to protect. And he's just thinking, oh, I'm not very good at my job here.
Maybe he'd got 10 in the sweepstake, and then this is the moment where he lost his money. Who knows? So we mentioned earlier that we're going to bring the Doctor in, and indeed we see Dr. Kaufman where Bond meets him. He's a sadistic assassin. In parallel, Carver's goons are trying to break into Bond's car in the, I think it was the hotel car park. And this is the point where I had to check my phone, because I recognised the actor who played Kaufman as the ghost on the train in the film Ghost with Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore. And he's, for those who have seen the film Ghost, you'll remember him shouting, "Get off my train," to Swayze, which is one of my favourite scenes from that film. So that's kind of what made me think that's who it is, and so that's the point where I looked at my phone to confirm that.
Andy, just going back to when Carver tells, I think it's Gupta, to get the Doctor in, don't you think that's a bit over the top? Because obviously Carver is married to Paris. He's just seen a 10-second security clip of Paris saying something like, "Do you still sleep with your gun under your pillow?" Which is all done in past tense. Yet he goes and basically gets assassinated because of that comment.
Yeah, this is, there's being possessive, and then there's taking it to a whole new level, isn't there? I mean, clearly he's going to be intimidated by Bond, and maybe he's kind of putting two and two together and coming up with 007, but he's almost like he's assuming that, well, now Bond's back in the scene, she's going to cheat on me, because how can I compete with Bond? So I need to eliminate the problem. But even so, it's escalated very quickly. That's for sure. Bond is with the Doctor. The Doctor's talking about how, what is he saying? He's basically implying that he's going to make it look like Bond has killed Paris and then killed himself. I think that's what he's setting up. But Bond's too smart for him, and the Doctor ends up tasering himself. So then Bond kills the Doctor. And
now we've got the customary Bond car chase scene, and this is a scene that me and Andy's mentioned, earlier on in the podcast, and it's a fun scene where we see Bond using a remote control to escape with his car, and Bond is chased through the multi-story car park as well. So there is a little cool scene here as well where the Bond is laid down on the back of the seat using his phone / remote control to control the BMW, and you see a bloke stood with a rocket launcher that shoots. He aims at the car, but it goes through the front and back window and then destroys the baddie's car behind Bond. And I had two thoughts around this scene. Why didn't the baddie just shoot the engine? Why even shoot at the windows with the rocket launcher? Seems like a novice mistake. But also, during the car chase scene, there's a bit where Bond tries to blow open the sliding down barrier doors. Do you remember that bit? But nothing happens. So the multi-story car park is part of the hotel. So why would they have some kind of like missile-proof barriers? Do you recall that bit, Andy?
I do, yeah. Because he fires, like you said, he fires it, and then you see the smoke, and then when the smoke clears, the doors are still intact.
Yeah, so he has to like reverse or turn around, doesn't he?
Yeah.
So that just made me wonder, like, why have they got really good security? You can understand if it was at, say, Carver's place or something, but this is all happening as he's escaping from the hotel car park. He's just left Paris's room. He's found that the goons are trying to break into his car, and then it's all in that car park.
Yeah, what kind of guests do they get at this hotel that they need missile-proof barriers on the car park?
Yeah, indeed. So that's all Hamburg done now. So that's all Germany done, and we're in the US airbase / the airplane. And I made a note here, Andy. I was so giddy when this happened. Bond is wearing his full Royal Naval uniform, and this is only the third time that we see Bond in a Bond film wearing his full naval gear. But the hat returns, and me and the missus was when I start watching the film, I have my little notepad, and I always say to the missus, don't remind me, when we do the Bond, James Bond martini watch and the hat and throw, I've got little tick boxes that I do. And she was saying before this started, I think we're finished. We're not going to see another hat now. I don't remember Brosnan wearing a hat or Daniel Craig. I said, let's wait and see. Let's wait. And when it happened, I was like, yes, wearing a hat. So I did my big tick. So I'm really glad. And we can talk about the hat watch later on, how many films it's been, that we've had, since there's been a hat. But we also meet Jack Wade again. And obviously Wade was in GoldenEye, so we're seeing him again. And this felt a bit out of place, Andy. And I don't know if this is what the CIA give their agents in the field, but he was wearing a very jazzy dinosaur shirt, and he was wearing a hat, but I don't think the hat had dinosaurs, but it was a jazzy outfit, wasn't it, what he was wearing?
It was like he'd just come from the beach or something.
Yeah. Maybe he's just come back from Havana. He was still there from after GoldenEye, just enjoying Cuba and the delights that you find down there.
Just waiting for Bond's phone call.
Yeah. So this is the last film that we see Joe Don Baker, and as we mentioned in last week's episode in GoldenEye, Baker has appeared in The Living Daylights as Brad Whitaker and as Jack Wade in the Brosnan's first two films, which is obviously GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies.
That's a nice run he's had there. Later on, Bond jumps from a plane. He's to search for the sunken British ship. So jumping from the plane into the ocean. He searches the sunken ship, identifies that a missile is missing, and Bond and Whalen come across each other while searching for the sunken. Yeah, let me do that again. And Bond and Whalen come across each other while searching the sunken vessel. Easy for me to say. I kind of liked this because it reminded me of old school Bond with the diving scenes. This was very, very Connery-esque, I'd say. Thunderball in particular stands out as very diving heavy.
I agree, Andy. And when we've spoken about each of the films, over the weeks, Sean Connery had it felt he had a lot of underwater scenes. We've mentioned about Roger Moore having a lot of skiing scenes, and I agree, definitely this does feel a bit of a throwback, and it was nice, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. The ship is balancing on an edge and it's slowly tipping over, and it's about to sink further Luckily, Bond and Whaling managed to escape via a missile tube and swim to the surface, where unfortunately they're met by Stamper.
So we're in Saigon now, and we see Carver is writing Bond and Whaling's obituaries as well. So he's always at the forefront of the news, isn't he? Can you imagine Carver now? He'd be on Twitter all the time, wouldn't he?
He would be insufferable on Twitter, I would imagine. Do you think he would write his own tweets? I mean, he's obviously writing his own news here, even though he's the head honcho. I mean, I can't imagine Rupert Murdoch or Ted Turner writing their own news. They have teams of people like that, but no, he's doing it himself. But yeah, modern day Elliot Carver, I'd be blocking him, that's for sure.
I can imagine him getting banned.
Yeah, very, very Trump-esque, I would imagine, some of his views. I made a note here as well, whilst he was typing out. He was kind of, I think he was saying out loud what he was typing, and he mentioned the word dead, and he must have typed about 18 letters. It was, the typing was really, really noticeably fake.
Yeah, because I remember that, and I didn't write a note down this. You did. And I can't quite remember. Was it like I know it can't have been, but was it like a tablet he was typing on, or a keyboard? But it was just so over the top. I thought, bloody hell, I thought his words per minute must be really high.
I think he was like just holding a keyboard in one hand and typing with the other. This is just for Jay, because obviously we're not doing this video, but it was essentially like this. There's a keyboard, and he's holding it in one hand, and he just went, dead. Something along those lines, wasn't it?
Yeah. So one more point here. Carver and Stamper show off their torture toys. And I can't remember, I didn't write it down. There was a particular name that he used that they're planning to use on Bond and Whaling.
I can't remember the name, but it was the one that was kind of like a combination of hook and knife, wasn't it? It was kind of like half knife, half hook. It looked pretty gruesome, whatever it was called, that's for sure.
When he was talking about that, and it's totally not, it's not related to Bond, but it's related, it is in a way, because it was this scene. But when he was talking about it, it reminded me of the scene in Braveheart, where William Wallace is getting tortured by the English.
So that's a good analogy there. But never fear, Bond and Whaling manage to escape. They jump off the skyscraper, and there's a huge banner of Carver hanging from the side of the skyscraper, and they use that to scale the building, basically, like kind of jumping and hanging onto it. That was quite a nice scene, I thought. And it kind of rips down the middle of his face, doesn't it, as well, which kind of adds to the visual. We then get motorbike chase. So Bond and Whaling have a slight disagreement about who drives the motorbike. They've got to work together because they're still handcuffed to each other, of course. And there's one part where, in order to maneuver how they want to, or how Whaling wants to, she basically has to mount him. And Bond is quite happy with that, has to be said.
He's very happy. And Andy, I found a little tidbit which I didn't write down. The bit where they have the disagreement about who drives the motorbike. What happened is, before that scene was shot, the director spoke to both Brosnan and Michelle Yeoh. He spoke to them both individually, and he said to both of them, I want you to drive the motorbike. So where they had that disagreement, it was genuine. So I thought that was a quite little interesting tidbit there.
Yeah,
I just had to
motivation.
Yeah, I just had to check my notes in terms of my quiz, because I can't remember if I put it in my quiz, but I didn't, so it was safe to mention there. And this whole motorbike / helicopter scene, I think, is really, really fun. I mentioned this is one of my favourite scenes at the beginning, and it's really cool, and I think it's very modern as well, and it doesn't feel like, oh, this is just another James Bond car chase scene. And I think it helped as well. Obviously the helicopter made it exciting as well, but there was also elements where they're going through the narrow streets in Vietnam. They were riding on top of the buildings. There's also that point where the helicopter comes down to kind of try to look for Bond and Whaling, and the motorbike goes across the two buildings and jumps across the helicopter. I thought that whole scene or scenes, you know, in terms of the whole chase was really exciting. But I wasn't too sure about the bit with the helicopter where it used its rotor to kind of attack Bond. And I think it happened twice, you know, where it kind of tilted. And I was like, oh, originally I was thinking there's a bit where Bond and Wei Lin have quite a lot of shoppers. I'm trying to think. The innocent bystanders were stood around. And you know, when a helicopter initially tilted and going forward, I thought there were going to be loads of collateral damage there. But later on as well, when the helicopter, Bond and Wei Lin managed to put the metal cable on it, and the helicopter crashes into the building. Did you notice the dummies there? Because the dummies, they weren't even kind of camouflaged. Their skin looked like the kind of crash dummies that they use. So they didn't even kind of like put like long clothes on, like long shirts or something to kind of disguise that fact.
Yeah, I'd got a brief glimpse of quite obvious dummies there. As part of the escape, Wei Lin, I think she uses her earring to kind of take her half of the handcuffs off, but then she handcuffs Bond to a shower pipe. Then later on, she goes to the Chinese safe house and she's attacked, but she can clearly look after herself. Very much Bond's equal, I would say. Bond joins her, but she can handle her own. And we both made this note that the Chinese safe house is something that Q would absolutely love. Lots of weapons, lots of gadgets. There's even a fire-breathing dragon. It was a cool setup, I thought. But one thing I did make note of here, when she kind of raises up like a workstation type thing with all kinds of monitors and keyboards and stuff on, and Bond doesn't understand the lettering on the keyboard. So his previous life at university studying Oriental languages has clearly not come to fruition, has it?
I agree, Andy, and it is something I noticed, but I didn't comment. But I wonder if there's any listeners out there that have read the novelization of Tomorrow Never Dies. Because, Andy, I remember reading something about Oriental languages, but I can't quite remember what the actual context was. Well, the general feeling was that in the story, apparently Bond has lied and said that he never actually did Oriental languages at Oxford, but I couldn't find anything that actually backed that up in terms of, you know, I've not read the book and I couldn't find it as part of the research. So there's any listeners out there that has read the book that can confirm whether does Bond admit to lying about Oriental languages. Therefore, you know, it makes sense that he doesn't know the keyboard symbols. We later see some aerial shots of islands, and this reminded me of The Man with the Golden Gun as well, where you've got those little, I don't know what the correct word is for this, but the little islands dotted around where they're trying to look for the stealth ship. And Bond and Wei Lin locate the stealth ship and they manage to get on board and infiltrate Carver's ship. Now, we've got another little, I don't know if you call it a cameo, but we see Hugh Bonneville play a small part on the British naval ship as well. So this was Bonneville's second film role, and he's famous for the TV hit show Downton Abbey, which I've never seen, but I know he's also in obviously other TV and films. But I recall him from Notting Hill, if I remember correctly, as one of Hugh Grant's friends. I think so. I can see Andy.
I think so too as well. Yeah, I'm Googling that.
I gotta say, I could see him reaching for his phone there slightly, and he's either going to confirm that he was in Notting Hill or just put me back in my place and not to go off script again.
He played the role of Bernie in Notting Hill. You're absolutely right.
Yes.
One note here that has just come to mind. So you mentioned earlier Gerard Butler, second film role. It goes on to bigger and better things. Hugh Bonneville goes on to bigger and better things here. We had in an earlier film Dolph Lundgren, obviously making so Bond films are something of a stepping stone to success for then lesser known actors, and they go on to bigger and better things as a result of James Bond. So that's a few times we've made mention of now famous actors that were maybe not so famous back then.
Yeah, and we've obviously seen some Bond girl actors use this as a stepping stone as well. So the next point I made here, well, actually, sorry, my next note, Andy, I've made here is a note to say that I've made barely any more notes. So I wrote down here, just for our listeners, I've not made any notes for this part of the film where Bond and Wei-Lin get on the stealth ship because I was too busy enjoying the film. And I must hold up my hands now, Andy, because that's 2 films in a row where in the final quarter of the film, I've barely made any notes. So apologies there.
I've made a few. You're generally the one that leads this ship. I tend to do what's the opposite of the lion's share. You do the lion's share of the research and note taking, has to be said. You're the if we're going by the 80-20 rule, you're in the 80 camp. I must hold my hands up there. But I did make a few notes as we went on. There's a scene where there's a security guard and he's kind of sat at a desk with multiple screens, and Wei-Lin is clearly on the screens, and he's just sat there like writing something in a notepad, not paying attention at all. It's amateur hour stuff. And Elliot Carver shouts, "What the hell do I pay you for?" And got to be said, he's got a point there. Maybe someone called in sick and it's just kind of like he's got a temp in.
Or someone is doing media at university and this is his work placement and he's thinking like, what am I doing here? I'm supposed to be learning off Elliot Carver about media and I'm just on this little stealth ship watching security cameras.
And probably not even getting paid.
No.
Well, certainly won't be after his performance, that's for sure.
So, like I said, I haven't made many notes here. So Stamper does inform Carver that Bond is dead and he's caught Wei-Lin. But Bond obviously then gets seen during these scenes, and Carver makes a flippant comment which did make me chuckle when he finds out that Bond is alive. He says, "So much for German efficiency." And a note I made here, and this is the same throughout the whole film really, is the music is very modern, and this obviously goes back to, when we said about the opening music scene is David Arnold came on board, and it feels modern. It's really good. It's a big improvement on the GoldenEye soundtrack.
Yeah, it's really, really good. I made a note as well that Wei-Lin is just as much of a badass as Bond is. There's these final scenes where there's a lot of action and fighting. She can really hold her own. Really impressive stuff.
I agree, Andy. And she reminds me a bit of The Spy Who Loved Me, Amasova. She was like the Russian equivalent of Bond, and Wei-Lin is the Chinese equivalent of Bond. And we don't see it many times, do we, in the Bond franchise, where he has an equal for another organization. But Carver meets a very gruesome ending, and he's killed by the drilling missile that Bond that you see earlier on in the film at the beginning, where they use it to sink the ship. And that you don't see any blood, but imagine being, I think from memory, there's 3 massive drill components and then there's some smaller ones, and Carver does meet a fitting end. He's obviously killed Paris Carver by proxy, so I think that's quite fitting. And the last comment from me before Andy kind of takes us to the end is Stamper is very strong, and Bond and Stamper, they have a fight to the death. Stamper gets his foot stuck, doesn't he, where the missile kind of falls on his foot, ankle, and he can't escape, and Bond manages to escape here.
Yeah, I liked this fight. I did make a note though. So Stamper, like you said, is very strong, but he's almost kind of like super strength. But when you see them side by side, Stamper's clearly in good shape, but he's not particularly massive in comparison with Bond. They're actually quite similar size. So it just feels a bit out of place that Bond would be kind of ragdolled around. It's not like he's going up against a Jaws-like character who's, massively outweighs and towers above him. They're kind of similar size, so that felt a little bit out of place for me. We're getting to the end now. Bond saves Wei-Lin from drowning. I think she's got a chain wrapped around her, and he gives her mouth-to-mouth underwater and then kind of like frees her from the chains, if I remember correctly. And they end up at sea waiting to be rescued. And this is a proper old school Bond ending where he gets his girl in the end, just like many, many other Bond films before. And they live happily ever after for however long that lasts. And my final note before we move on is that I actually preferred the closing song to the opening song, Surrender by K.D. Lang, which we mentioned earlier. I thought that was actually a stronger song.
That's an interesting view, Andy, because I was listening to them and I was thinking, well, I wanted to listen to, well, obviously I was listening to Sheryl Crow's version when we do the music ranking, but I was listening to Surrender as well, and I was thinking, did they make the right decision? And I couldn't make a decision. I couldn't really say one was better than the other. I don't think that either of them are very strong, if I'm being honest. But yeah, I couldn't say, oh, that they were right or wrong. You could have flipped a coin for me and picked one or the other for the beginning and the end.
The Rain Room.
This is a 60-second review by a James Bond superfan. This week's review has been provided by R2. R2, you have 60 seconds. Start the clock.
1997's Tomorrow Never Dies sees Bond taking on a media mogul Elliot Carver, who is trying to start a World War III between Britain and China. While GoldenEye was about the aftershocks of the Cold War, Tomorrow Never Dies is very contemporary by exploring the powers of mass media and British-Chinese relations during the time of Hong Kong handover. The film has a reputation as by-the-numbers entry without the standout elements of GoldenEye, but I would argue it also doesn't have its low points. In terms of looks, Brosnan is in his peak performance and he feels much more confident in the role, which is good as he is paired with Michelle Yeoh's Wei Lin, who is one of the strongest allies in the series, even though the chemistry between the two is rather weak. The villain played by Jonathan Pryce is a hammy caricature echoing characters like Rupert Murdoch and Steve Jobs, but lacks the edge that would make him a truly threatening villain. The action scenes are very solid, with a special mention to opening action scene and Wei Lin's martial arts fights. Also, a special shout out to first score composed by David Arnold that masterfully combines classic John Barry sounds with modern flourishes. The film's a solid 7 out of 10.
A big thank you to R2 for recording this week's 60-second review by a James Bond superfan on the Rating Room.
The Rain Room.
So we move on to our usual section of the one-liners and quotes. So I've got two small ones and Andy has got a bigger one sandwiched between my two bits. So let me just kick off one of my little interactions between Paris and James Bond. So Paris goes, do you know I used to look in the papers every day for your obituary? And James Bond says, well, I'm sorry I keep disappointing you.
And before I move on to mine, I've done a bit of research. She should have looked at the Hong Kong Standard from Saturday 9th of July 1966 and the headline, British Naval Commander Murdered.
That's very good, Andy.
So earlier I mentioned an interaction between Q and James Bond. So this is a bit of back and forth. I'm not going to do accents because it's not in my contract to, but I'll try and get the point across. So we'll start with Q. He says, it's the insurance damage waiver for your beautiful new car. Now, will you need collision coverage? Bond replies, yes. Fire? Probably. Property destruction? Definitely. Personal injury? I hope not, but accidents do happen. They frequently do with you. Well, that takes care of the normal wear and tear. Is there any other protection I need? Only from me, 007, unless you bring that car back in pristine order. I thought it was a nice interaction between the two of them,
I thought so. And this is the bit where Q is pretending to be a rental salesman or something, car rental, isn't it, at the airport?
Yes, in his shiny red jacket.
Yeah. So the last quote, and it's a one-liner, and it's Stamper to Bond, and Mr. Stamper says, I owe you an unpleasant death, Mr. Bond. So just a small one there to finish that little segment off.
So moving on from that, we're going to talk book versus movie. So in this instance, it was movie first, and Raymond Benson wrote the Tomorrow Never Dies novelization, which was the first of 3 Bond novels, the other 2 being The World Is Not Enough and Die Another Day.
And the book includes a nod to You Only Live Twice, where the book suggests that Bond lied when he took a course in Oriental languages. So this is what I mentioned earlier, Andy. And the book also expands on the backstories of Elliot Carver and Wei Lin. And from what I read, Andy, the the Elliot Carver backstory, actually, it makes Carver come across a lot more evil.
Chief of Staff Bill Tanner is in the novelisation rather than Charles Robinson. So, moving on, next part, do you want to hear another one of my world-famous James Bond jokes?
I do, and hopefully our listeners do as well, Andy.
Okay, this is a nice one, this one. Where do James Bond actors go when they die?
I don't know. Where do they go?
00 heaven.
Oh, I like what you did there, Andy.
You see, because heaven rhymes with 7.
Oh.
And James Bond is 007. It's good when I explain the jokes. It adds to the humour, I find.
Yes. Do you ever do any of these jokes on your better half?
I do, and I'm normally met with plenty of eye rolling, has to be said.
And tumbleweed.
Yeah. As with many other aspects of life when I interact with them.
Are you ready? Let's start the quiz.
So our regular listeners will know this is where I will throw 4 statements at Andy, and he will guess which 2 are incorrect and which 2 are correct. So I think, Andy, I haven't referenced my notes. I think you got 50% last week. So, and I think you also made a comment you haven't got 0% so far in the 17 episodes that we've done previously. So you're either getting 50% or 100%. So you're doing well. So,
that's going to come back to haunt me, isn't it, at some point?
I was walking the dog earlier and I'm thinking I've only got a few episodes left to try to get Andy to get 0%. But no. So, okay. These are the 4 statements. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do this.
Okay. And listeners, feel free to play along at home as well. First statement. This is the first movie in history to have its entire budget covered in product placements. Second statement. The film continues the Bond tradition of opening at number 1 in the opening weekend. Third statement. Michael G. Wilson, who's one of the producers, can be seen as one of the characters on screen when Carver is getting the stories from the different offices. And the last statement. The Halo jump, which is the bit where he jumps from the aeroplane, was performed by the same stuntman that did the GoldenEye damn bungee jump. So would you like me to repeat any of them?
No, I think I got them all. I'm going straight in.
Oh, okay.
Number 1, false. Number 2, true. Number 3, true. Number 4, false. Do you want me to explain any of those?
Yeah, you can give me some rationale, yeah?
Have I got this? Hang on, fact. Have I got this the wrong way round? Oh, I've ruined it.
I've just colour-coded this,
Oh,
Andy,
God,
now.
you're going to have to do this again. Sorry.
You said it was false, true, true, false.
Yeah, I didn't mean that.
Oh, let me just turn all my colour-coding off now.
Yeah, we'll cut this out. It's fine.
Okay. First one.
First one. Oh, God, I'm confused now.
Because if you... yeah, carry on.
Okay. True, false, true, false. That's what it is.
So just to confirm, then, the 2 that you're saying is true is the whole budget was covered by product placements for the first time in history, and Michael G. Wilson can be seen as one of the characters on the screen when Carver is getting the different story updates where we mention about the president and the software.
Yeah, because I think the number 1 film is incorrect because of Titanic, and I can't imagine the same stuntman doing that stunt as within GoldenEye. I just can't see it.
Okay, Andy, you have 100% this week.
Back in the game.
So I'm just going to put my little quiz tracker here and type in 100%. So Andy, I've got a little bit of information here to go with that. So the reason it wasn't at number 1 in the opening weekend, so this was the first time that Bond didn't open at number 1 in the opening weekend because it was the same week that Titanic was there. So you are correct. Michael G. Wilson was one of the characters, and he was the character actually that mentioned about sliming the president. And the first movie in history, so you're correct. So This is the first movie in film history to have its entire budget covered in product placements, and that was BMW, L'Oreal, Heineken, Dunhill, Ericsson, Omega watches, Smirnoff vodka, and then there were other companies as well which covered the 100 million film budget. I think it was 110 to be precise. So just when I read that, I thought, imagine making a film and you've not actually had to pay for it. You basically got all the sponsors to cover the payment. It's just
a free film.
Crazy, isn't it? Yeah. Well done, Andy. That's 100%.
The Rain Room.
So that is that segment, and now we're moving on to the rankings, which I think a lot of listeners like to listen to, just to kind of see how we're different, but also listeners who are rewatching the films as well, or kind of like rank theirs as well, and how different we are to each other, but also from them. And as always, feel free to contact us on social media or our website as well if you disagree or agree, or if you have any particular points in terms of justifying where you position a certain film or actor, villain, etc. So it's always interesting to kind of see those comments. So I'm going to kick us off and talk about runtimes, kill count, and martinis. So runtime, and Andy, you alluded to this earlier as well. Tomorrow Never Dies, as you mentioned, is 1 hour 59 minutes, and that is the 14th longest Bond film. So it's the 5th shortest, and it's the first time since 1967 where it's shorter than 2 hours. So the kill count, we mentioned at the top of the pod that James Bond gets 30 kills, and that comes in at 3rd place. So that's just below Spy Who Loved Me at number 2 with 31. But last week's GoldenEye is out there at the moment with 47. So Brosnan has done 2 films, and he's got 77 kills across those 2 films, which is an average of 38.5, which interestingly puts him above Sean Connery, because Sean Connery has done 72 kills in 6 movies. So Pierce Brosnan has gone above Sean Connery already, Andy, in 2 films.
He is proficient, you have to say, with his kills. It's not even close, is it?
No, it's quite scary. Moving on, Andy mentioned that martini, James Bond does drink martini in Tomorrow Never Dies, and that a good run now. We've had, what's that, GoldenEye, License to Kill, Living Daylights. So the last film that James Bond didn't drink a martini was A View to a Kill.
Thank you, Jay. Moving on to the introduction of Bond, James Bond. I mentioned earlier, this came after 30 minutes and 25 seconds. So of the 18 films, we've had 15 films where the introduction occurs. This is actually the 5th longest it takes to appear, so 11th shortest by that mark. Also mentioned earlier, we do see James Bond in the hat when he's wearing his full navy outfit, but no throwing of the hat. It remains in place on his head. We don't see the return of Felix Leiter. We've got Jack Wade in his place, so 2 in a row without Felix. And then moving on to the box office, so Jay mentioned this earlier, the budget 110 million, by far the biggest budget so far. 339.5 million in terms of worldwide box office. Now, as things stand in terms of actual takings, that would put it 2nd on the list, with GoldenEye topping the list slightly above on 356. In terms of the adjusted box office so far, it's actually quite low down the list. It'd be 12 out of 18 at just over 600 million on the adjusted box office scale. So, you know, obviously it's 2 different ways of looking at it there, but either way you could, it's a financial success.
Thank you, Andy. So moving on, we're going to discuss Bond girls now. So as we've mentioned in the last few episodes, we've got a lot of Bond girls now. So let me have a quick look. We're up to 63 Bond girls now across the 18 films that we've covered. So we're not going to go through everyone. We're just going to go through the Bond girls that feature in Tomorrow Never Dies. And I'm going to start us from the lowest position, and that is Inga Bergstrom, the Professor. I've put her in at 57 out of 63, and that for me, I can't justify her any higher than that, Andy, because she's not in it long. She's in it for a few minutes, and therefore I've got to put her in with people like Caroline from GoldenEye, Linda from The Living Daylights, Log Cabin Girl, Bambi, Thumper. So she's got to be in that lower segment. Like, you know, you mentioned a few times about football table. So she's fighting relegation, but she's obviously a very attractive lady, Andy. But you know, with screen time, I can't justify putting her any higher. But Paris Carver. So I think I mentioned last week, Andy, my GoldenEye Bond girls, none of them really was high. Whereas this week, I've got, I think, 2 high entries. Paris Carver comes in at 13, and Wei Lin breaks the top 10. So Wei Lin is the first modern Bond girl that has broken into my top 10 for quite a while. Paris Carver, I put in at 13, so she's just below Octopussy, but just one above Sylvia Trench. I couldn't justify putting her any higher, Andy, because she doesn't have much screen time. Well, she has enough screen time to warrant a high enough score, but she doesn't add much. You know, she's that romantic interest, and she's really there purely for that romantic interest for Bond. Wei Lin is completely the opposite. You know, we've said that she's pretty much the Chinese equivalent of Bond. She's brilliant. It's nice to see a strong female again in the franchise. I mentioned earlier about Amasova from The Spy Who Loved Me by Barbara Bach. So it was good to see another strong female here. Personally, she doesn't break into the top 5. So she is below Melina, Amasova, Tatiana, Pussy Galore and Tracy. But she does move above the original Bond girl, Honey Rider. So she goes in at number 6. I think that's a strong entry for those two. What about you, Andy? How different were you compared to me?
So I don't think we were a million miles apart here. In terms of the 3 as standalone rankings, we've gone in the same order. So I've got Bergstrom as bottom of the 3. I went slightly higher with my ranking. She's gone in at number 49, and for the same reasons you, lack of screen time, not really pivotal to anything storyline related. Reminded me very much of Log Cabin Girl, so she goes in just one place above Log Cabin Girl. So 49 of 63. So she's fighting relegation, but she survives with a couple of games to go, to use the football analogy. Now, in terms of Paris Carver, I think with an extended role and more pivotal to the storyline, she could have been another top 10 for me. But you know, she dies fairly early on in the film, but still cracks the top 20. She goes in at number 18 for me, just above Holly Goodhead, just below Fiona Volpe. So 18 for Paris Carver. Very beautiful, very very strong character. Just don't see much of her because she dies fairly early on. Which then leaves Wei Lin and just outside the top 10 for me. So I've put Wei Lin at 12, just below Octopussy, just above Melina Havelock. Really, a really strong character. Obviously, Bond's equal in many ways in terms of the role, but not as good as the likes of Anya Amasova, who's in at my number 3. And thinking back to last week where we talked about GoldenEye, I slightly preferred Xenia on a top. So for that reason, she's a couple of places below. But number 12, still a very strong entry into the charts for me. Next up, we've got the theme song, which is Tomorrow Never Dies by Sheryl Crow. Disappointing for me, this one. We may have spoken about this previously. I don't know if we did it on the pod or outside of the recording, but this is one of the first ones for me that just doesn't feel like a Bond song. It's an okay song, but it's not a very good Bond song for me, and for that reason it goes in at 17 out of 18, only saved from the bottom spot by Lulu's the man with the golden gun, which is not good at all. What's your thoughts on this, Jay?
I totally agree with you, Andy, in terms of it doesn't feel like a James Bond song. It's a weak one for me. I pull it in at 16 though, so you pull it in at 17. So below Tomorrow Never Dies, I've got The Man with the Golden Gun and From Russia With Love by Matt Monro. So the Matt Monro song I just don't like, but it is definitely one of the weaker entries. So I don't think there's much else we can say on that one, Andy. So I'm just going to move along to the opening credits. So for me, I've gone, it was a weak song, but the opening credits I think were really strong. And I put GoldenEye at number 9 last week out of the 17 films, and now we've got 18 films. I've actually put Tomorrow Never Dies in at number 3. Like I said at the beginning, it feels like the most modern one, and I like what they did with the whole morphing of the models and the circuitry as well. And you got your usual silhouettes and all the kind of staples of the Bond franchise. You got some X-ray effects, breaking monitors, and etc. etc. But I really like the beginning of this one, and I think the only thing that probably for me meant it scored a slightly lower, but I did kind of separate them, was it would have been nice to see that with a better song to go with it. But I have marked this one at number 3, so it's the top 3, and the only two songs, the only two opening credits I got above this is On Her Majesty's Secret Service and Goldfinger. So I think it was a really, really strong song. Opening credits. What were your thoughts?
So see, this is where we massively differ. I went with number 4 for GoldenEye last week. I thought it was a really strong effort. And whilst I appreciate what they tried to do for Tomorrow Never Dies, I just didn't like it really. It didn't work for me at all. And for that reason, I've gone at number 14. So just above Dr. No, which was kind of, the flashing circles and squares and silhouettes and, about as basic as it can get. I appreciate the intent, but I thought the execution just wasn't very good for me. So it's towards the bottom, 14 out of 18. Next up, we have villains. So we've got 4 to add to the list this week, which takes us to a total of 57. I want to start towards the bottom again, but what I will say as kind of my opening gambit, I think as a group of villains, this might have been the weakest bunch so far of all the franchise when looking at their collective rankings. So I'm going to start bottom up. So in at 52 and 53, I've got Dr. Kaufman and Henry Gupta. Gupta being the 53, so it's slightly worse. Just 2 characters that didn't contribute a lot, didn't appear a lot, somewhat what's the word I'm looking for? Almost irrelevant, really. Gupta added nothing, in my opinion. Was just a character in the crew, didn't really do anything. And Dr. Kaufman, as much as I recognized him, I knew straight away, and he was on the screen for a very short period of time and was very ineffectual. So I couldn't really justify putting him anywhere high in the list. So 52 and 53 for those. Moving slightly up, I got Stamper in at 42 out of 57. Stamper reminded me somewhat of Stamper reminded me somewhat of Emil Leopold Locke from For Your Eyes Only, just not as good. He was something of a menacing presence, was again quite ineffectual at times. Wasn't as intimidating as some other characters we've seen in the past. Wasn't as menacing. I don't know. Again, another character that just didn't really work for me as a henchman. So 42 was about as high as I could go. So that leaves Elliot Carver, the main man, only 37 for me. I was looking through my list, thinking where can I slot him in, and he's just so weak in comparison to other lead villains. There was nothing intimidating. There was nothing particularly evil. You know, we talked about he was a little bit unhinged, and you know his reactionary to stuff was over the top, but he wasn't particularly villainous in comparison with some of the others. I just found the whole group were really quite weak. So 37 was where I put Carver. So they're all kind of in that bottom half for me. What about you, Jay? What do you think?
I agree, Andy, in terms of your opening statement, and I've made a note here to say weak villains. And my note is the best movies tend to have the better villains in the franchise. So when I looked at our top 5/10 and then correlated that against our top films, the higher the film, the higher rated we've done the villains. And I agree. And my kind of comment as well was, well, my thought process was, if Tomorrow Never Dies had better villains, would have that meant the film would have scored higher? Because I do think the villains do let down this film. I think you've got one really good Bond girl, then you've got another Bond girl that's, she's fine, we've rated her highly. It was the villain aspect that I think let the film down a bit. So I've got the Doctor in at 45, Henry Gupta at 42, and they are near enough to Milton Crest and Dr. Mortner from License to Kill and The View to Kill. Stamper, when I was watching Tomorrow Never Dies, Stamper reminded me a little bit of Necros from The Living Daylights. So I've got him in at 34, which is just one place above Necros there, so close enough. Elliot Carver, so I don't think he's a very good villain, but he is the primary villain, so I do score him, and I do think he's better than the other three, like you. But I then worked my way up, and I thought he's better than Brad Whittaker, better than Koskov, Christatus, and then I was slowly moving my way up, and I got to Emilio Largo at 28, and I thought, yeah, I don't rate Emilio Largo. And then the next one above that on my list was Xena Onatop, and I thought, well, Carver's not better than Onatop. I know Onatop's a secondary villain, but she is. I'd rather fight Elliot Carver than Onatop, and that's why I put Elliot Carver at 27. So I agree, Andy, with the weak villains. I have scored them higher than you, but they are. Well, I'm just looking. The bottom half of the table. All four of them on my side, and especially on your side. So like I said, there's a definite correlation to the movie. So if I bring us to the movies now, we've given the score out of 10 at the beginning of the podcast. So just to recap, I've given Tomorrow Never Dies 7 out of 10. And like we've said previously in the podcast season, we're not doing each film has to be slotted in. We're not doing any joint position. So I've got, let's see how many I've got here. I've got 6 films that also have 7 out of 10. So I've actually slotted in Tomorrow Never Dies, which Andy might disagree here, but I did find the film really good. I like I said, I really enjoyed the film. The music score is an improvement on GoldenEye, but Michelle Yeoh is a brilliant Bond girl. But the two things I think bring the ranking down a bit is weak villains and the main storyline, basically starting World War III just so he can expand his news empire, just feels a bit weak. So I really enjoyed the film. It didn't feel like 2 hours. I know it was just shy of 2 hours. I really enjoyed it. So it's high in terms of the 7 out of 10s, but for me, The Spiral of Me was a better film, so it's in at number 6 for me. So it's sandwiched between 2 Roger Moore films, actually, Spiral of Me and For Your Eyes Only. So it's a very respectable 7 out of 10. I did really enjoy it, like I said, and when initially I watched it, I thought it was on par if not potentially better than GoldenEye. But then having slept on it, writing the notes, doing the research, thinking about the rankings of the villains, the Bond girls, etc., I thought, I can't really warrant it. I don't think it is as good as GoldenEye. But then I do think it's better than Dr. No, Thunderball, License to Kill. But it's not as good as Roger Moore's best entry, which is The Spy Who Loved Me. So that is my placement, Andy, in terms of Tomorrow Never Dies. What about you?
So I gave this 6 out of 10. So it joins, now becomes a group of 5 with that ranking. And of the 5, this goes kind of in the middle of the 5. So Thunderball and Dr. No I thought were slightly better films. But Tomorrow Never Dies was slightly better than Octopussy and You Only Live Twice, in my opinion. But because of where that fits in the rankings, that means it's number 12 on my list. So it's bottom half. You know, I know we're only 1 mark different, but in terms of a ranking out of the 18, we're quite a way apart here. And to your point, I think the things that let it down were the same as what you've covered. The villains very, very weak as a collective and individually, and the storyline wasn't particularly great either. We're going to talk movies by actor in a moment, and the Bond actors themselves. I think Brosnan's performance held it up for me. You know, without Brosnan, this could have been much lower down the list. I think he is outperforming the films around him so far. Even with GoldenEye to an extent, I thought you know, that was a very solid output, but it was because of Brosnan as opposed to in spite of. This one was a weaker film in spite of Brosnan. So you know, he's carrying his load for me. So where that ranks in terms of actor, it means obviously Brosnan's got 2 on the board so far. I gave GoldenEye 7 out of 10, and I gave this 6 out of 10. So the ranking is very easy to decipher from that. What about you, Jay? Just to remind the listeners.
Yeah, so GoldenEye I gave 8 out of 10, and Tomorrow Never Dies does 7 out of 10. So yeah, we've only got the 2. And Andy, I know you're quick with maths, so you know you probably don't need the aid of this little bit. But for my score, I've given the 2 films 15 out of 20, which is a average of 7.5.
Indeed, so a 6.5 average for mine by those same maths.
Moving on to the last bit actually, which is Bond actors, and I'm going to keep this short and sweet, Andy. We've been going for quite a while now, and for me, it doesn't change the ranking. It's a strong entry. So Pierce Brosnan is still my number 2 in terms of Bond actors. What about you?
Brosnan remains my number 2 as well, surprisingly. I always thought Moore would be higher, but I think so far Brosnan is outperforming Moore. So he stays in at number 2. Connery is still untouchable so far, but there's time for that to change.
Very good. So Andy, do you want to remind our listeners what is next week's film?
I will, but I wanted to just give a little story about behind the scenes negotiations that we have. So you originally said, can you do 18 episodes of a podcast with me? And I said, yeah, sure. And then you said, well, I need you to do a 19th. So I said, well, make me an offer. And you offered me money, and you offered me diamonds, and then you offered me the world. And I said to you, Jay, the world is not enough. But eventually we struck a deal, and I'll be back next week to talk about The World Is Not Enough.
Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to The Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels, and be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.